Now we're going to add our resultant. We have our equilibriant in here, and we've got the two vectors of interest, vector B and vector C. So let's put in the resultant. We already calculated our resultant component terms, so we can use those to apply this resultant, which should be right about here, almost as long as the as vector A. So let's right click, let's select data, and one more time we're going to add a vector. Let's call it resultant, and start adding our points in here. So let's move it out of the way. So we need, in this case, again 0, but this time we're going to skip all the way down to minus 202, and then we do the same thing for y. 0 and 9 becomes our x component, and when we click OK, we end up with our resultant. And we can see the resultant is not quite in line, and we wouldn't expect it to be because we had this 9 as our component. So let's highlight it. Let's change it to bright red, and we'll put an arrow at the end again, just off the screen, and start adding our labels. So when we do that, add labels, it put what we thought we wanted. Let's click on it again, format, let's choose the series name, get rid of the Y value, and let's put it to the left. Yeah, I think that'll work. If you don't like the left, you can put it just above. That works just as well. So let's delete the one at the origin, and now we have the resultant of vector B and vector C in our relationship here. Now if we want to actually calculate the resultant, what we would have to do is square the x value, square the y value, sum it, take the square root, and you would end up with the resultant length here. And then if we take the inverse tangent of y over x, we should get our angle on that. So we can do that. We can take, let's go over here and let's call this Rx. Let's call this Ry, and let's call this R. Okay, and it'll just be R. Let's bold it so we know that's R, and we've got everything centered here, so we can do that. So R sub X, we can actually sub that if we want. Why don't we do that? So let's highlight that. Let's right click on it. If we get our, we need to get our font feature here. Let's see if we do it down here. If we highlight it, we don't get our font feature here. And formatting, oh, there it is. Okay, let's move this over. There it is. So I want to subscript that, so that's R sub X, and I'm going to highlight this one. I can do it up here. Format cells, subscript, and there I have my component. So if I wanted to square that, I can say square. We should get that value in here. We don't want the square root. We want actually the square of that value. So if we take that value 202, it doesn't give us this. So we can, let's see what's in here. If I look on the S's, that's the good thing about this, is I can come down here and I can look to see if those values, well, here's a nice way we can, well, that's not going to do it either. So we've got the sum of the squares, which we can do when we calculate our values actually, but I'm not seeing the square. Okay, how about if we do this the old-fashioned way? Let's take that value of 202 and multiply it by 202. That way we get the square of the value. Let's clean it up. Let's get rid of our superfluous values here. I know this is a little overkill, but you get a little extra education here. Okay, let's do the same thing for y. Let's take the value 9, multiply it times itself 9, and you got to make sure you don't click in another cell before you hit enter. And we'll take that back down, format cells, make it a number, decrease the decimal places, and those become our two terms. Now what we can do is the sum of the square. So we want to square each of these values, or we want to sum each of these values now that we've squared them. So if I take the square root, okay, if I take the square root and then I take the sum of the squares, where what I want to do is I want to put this value and that value, so I can put them both in there. I don't have to add them, all I have to do is highlight them, and what I end up with then is a sum of the squares. Okay, at this point the square root of the sum of the squares of those two values is not giving me what I want, because that number is way too big. So let's see what happens if I do put a plus in there instead. Still too big. So that's not giving us what we want. So what we need to do is, I'm going to delete that for right now. We ended up with our square values. We need to sum them and take the square root. So I'll leave that for right now, and we'll come back with that.